Welcome to episode 9 of the Ego Chall Podcast. I'm Preston Byers, and as always, I'm with Justin Binkowski. And today we're going to be talking about the Stage 2 Major and the boatload of RosterMania that we were kind of bombarded with yesterday and today. How you doing, Bink?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm sad because the Gorillas, they ruined my entire week. And
We'll get
fantasy
there.
also, yeah, we'll get there very shortly. So the way we're gonna do this, we're gonna go through most of the major matches, discuss them, give our thoughts, and then we're gonna talk about RosterMania and some big news regarding possible LAN events for the CDL in 2021. Hopefully, maybe, probably. So the Stage 2 Major began on Wednesday, April 7th, $500,000 event. And we started with the Paris Legion and the Los Angeles Thieves. The Thieves came in with a brand new roster. They put Kenny at main AR. They brought in Draza. So this roster had never played in a match before together, and they absolutely crushed the Legion 3-0, and they advanced to the second round. Any thoughts on how the Thieves looked with Kenny at main AR and Draza in the lineup?
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously the biggest takeaway was that they were able to perform with Kenny at the main AR role. Obviously, we had kind of touched on it in our previous episode with like JCap talking about the whole, like roles aren't really a thing in COD anymore debate. Regardless of your stance on that, it's still interesting to see Kenny in a quote-unquote main AR role when, just a few years ago he was in that main sub with the PPSH in World War II. Regardless, though, he performed pretty well, obviously. He had a 1.35 KD overall, 54 and 40. Draza actually had a 1.72 KD in his first series this year with 55 kills and 32 deaths. And most notably from this series, which obviously we will touch on a little bit later, but Fire really struggled. And, coming into this match, the Thieves obviously had made that change with benching Slasher and bringing in Draza, and they didn't have a whole lot of practice with that new four-man lineup. So me and you and probably plenty other people were mostly expecting Paris to win, but this was a pretty one-sided series, and they smoked them 6-0 on the search. It was raid search, and the control was 3-0-2 for the Thieves. So it was pretty one-sided. And for a team, last year Paris didn't make any roster changes, and there were rumors that they potentially might not make roster changes this year as well. This kind of last place finish against a team that wasn't really most well. I'm not gonna say well-rounded. It's just a team that didn't have a lot of practice coming into the major. A loss like that may have been the final nail in the coffin that forced their hand and led to Paris deciding to make a change.
Yeah. I mean, obviously I picked Paris because I said a few episodes ago I wouldn't pick Paris unless they were against a top team, and I didn't consider the Thieves to be a top team coming into the event. How I was wrong, and I was wrong in many, many more ways than just this one. But yeah, it did seem to be the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say, for Fire and for them to make this change, which is kind of surprising considering when we picked our players to get dropped first or benched first at the beginning of the season. I said Fire because I honestly just couldn't think of anybody else, and I didn't think Paris would be very good. But I mean, I honestly, after the first event, I didn't think he would get dropped at all. So for him to get dropped now, it's a pretty big surprise to me.
Yeah, it's not. He didn't even get benched. He just got straight up released, and we'll talk about that later. But I think that's the most surprising part of that change to me.
Yeah, I don't know how that happens. If they're I obviously wouldn't owe him any money because what would be the point of releasing him at that point? But I don't know. I don't know what the contracts are like in the CDL where they can just release someone mid-season. He obviously wasn't on a 2-week contract or whatever, so
yeah,
pretty interesting. In the saddest match of the day.
No. What? You're not going to get away with it that easily. You always get to introduce these matches. It's going to be my turn for this one in particular. So, the second match of the entire major, we have the Los Angeles Guerrillas going up against the Florida Mutineers. Now, coming into this major last week, our very own Preston Byers made a very bold prediction. And after the Los Angeles Guerrillas were the first team to take down the Atlanta FaZe in the 2021 CDL season in group play, Preston decided to throw a curveball a little bit and predict the Los Angeles Guerrillas to place top 3 or third place in this major. And yeah, so Preston, give us the recap here of this match and what your thoughts on it are.
Well, it was a hard-fought match, and the Guerrillas almost pulled it off, but they fell with the blaze of glory. They go down 3-0 to the Florida Mutineers in the first round. I would say, in my defense, I was being hopeful. I thought maybe, just maybe, the boys could bring it through and win about 5 more matches than they actually did. And I also did say that they were either a kind of get top 3 or get first rounded kind of team. It just so happened that they got first rounded this time, but maybe next major they get top 3. Who knows? I don't think that we'll see a roster change, so they're going to really remember this when they come back and win champs or something.
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, I also picked the Guerrillas to win this match. I did not pick them to come top 3. I picked them to win their first 2 matches, though, kind of along the same principle as you, that just they had looked like they had improved. They obviously had beaten FaZe in stage 2 group play, and then I believe their last match was against that Thieves team when Kenny wasn't playing. So they were kind of like, on a short winning streak, especially compared to their relative success throughout the rest of the season. And it looked like, if you think about them beating FaZe, you would probably expect them to, if they play like that, to continue that into the major, but that's just not what happened. So we'll also talk about that a little bit later. You said that you don't think they'll make a roster change. I'm not sure if I think they will or not, but it's definitely something they might have to consider, especially once we take a look. They just got last place in the major, so they didn't get any CDL points, so we'll take a look at the standings later, but they might be in that spot where it's either make a change now or they kind of ride it out and see how things go.
Yeah, I think the real reason I picked them is I actually did believe they could beat Florida, and I thought that Florida was way too inconsistent through stage 1 and stage 2, and LAG looked incredible at the end of stage 2. To be the first team to beat FaZe and to beat FaZe and S&D like they did, they absolutely stomped them. I thought those are 2 maps. Like, that's 2 maps for LAG, and I was thinking, well, Florida hasn't looked great in hardpoint or control, so LAG has a good shot of winning either of those. It just didn't happen. They looked really, really bad, and this is what LAG has looked like. They had a real low point against London early in stage 2 where they got absolutely wiped out, and then they completely turned it around seemingly and beat FaZe and finished with 2 wins. So I mean, I don't even know what to say, but it really ruined my bracket. It really ruined my day. It just wasn't a good time. Let's talk about Thursday matches. So Paris and LAG go out on day 1. And then you get some winners bracket matches on day 2 to start off. The New York Subliners versus the Dallas Empire. This is, I think, the 3rd time that these teams have played. They played once in stage 1 group play, a reverse sweep for Dallas, and also in the losers finals of the stage 1 major, which I believe Dallas swept or won 3-1 or something like that. I don't think that was a particularly close series. But this one was definitely not close. Dallas wins 3-0. What do you think of this? I obviously had New York going to the grand finals, so I was pretty surprised by this.
That was the other thing I was going to bring up, is not only did you have the Guerrillas top 3, but you also had New York top 2. I mean, I had Minnesota coming in second, so we were both wrong, obviously. But yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, in my bracket, I picked New York to win this 3-2. Coming into the major, Dallas didn't look particularly strong in Search and Destroy. And, New York went 4-1 in their group, and their only loss was to FaZe. So, in a lot of people's minds, New York was a really strong team coming into the major, and they just didn't show up when the tournament started. They ended up having an 0-6 map count at the tournament, and notably, Dallas wins this first Search and Destroy 6-0. Probably, obviously with the guys on Dallas's lineup, you expect Dallas to be a better search team than what they were showing before this major. But, especially with the way New York had been playing compared to how Dallas had been playing recently, I don't think anybody would have been like, oh yeah, Dallas is going to take, the Search and Destroy here 6-0. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, obviously we both had picked New York, but I guess thinking about it now, that means Dallas is 3-0 against New York on the season.
Well, I wrote this I edited this in an article today about New York. They were on a 4-match win streak coming into the major because they lost their first match to FaZe, and then they ran the table in their group, and they finished in a tie for first and lost the tiebreaker to FaZe. They had them and FaZe were the only teams to finish with 4 wins in stage 1 group play or stage 2 group play. So I thought, okay, New York is good. They lost to the best team in the league, and Dallas has looked really bad, particularly in search, but they haven't looked great in really any game mode. I really believed in New York, and so I would like to say that my second place team went 0-6 this event, and my third place team went 0-3 this event. I don't know what that says about my predictions goes, but I don't think it says anything flattering. Yeah. So New York gets dropped down to the losers bracket with their loss to Dallas, and then in the other winners round 1 match, Optic Chicago versus Toronto Ultra. I believe we both picked Optic to win in this match. Well, that didn't happen. Toronto upsets them 3-1. I mean, what is happening at this point? I literally to this point had not gotten a single match correct, prediction wise. So I don't know what's happening. What did you think of Toronto's upset over Optic?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even touched on it really, but Toronto ends up taking this event.
Oh yeah, that's a sidebar for this.
I'm just saying, we haven't even touched on it yet, but coming into this matchup, a lot of people probably were leaning towards Optic just because, Toronto went 2-3 in stage 2 group play. Optic only went 3-2, but they had that kind of a little bit of a roller coaster where they had that, terrible 0-2 week. Yeah. And then they bounced back in the last week of stage 2, and it looks like, they're kind of figuring it out. Maybe that week before that was just a fluke or, bad practice, whatever you want to chalk it up to. So a lot of people were, most likely leaning towards Optic. And then this is our first real sign of seeing, Toronto's potential, as it turns out, for them to take the entire tournament with all of these maps being pretty close. Optic takes the first hard point, checkmate 250 to 236, and then Toronto wins Moscow Search 6-5. They take raid control 3-1, and they take raid hardpoint 250 to 234. So it was a close series, but Toronto ended up getting the job done, and Optic drops down to the loser bracket right away.
Yeah, and I mean, Toronto has looked pretty good. At this point, they had looked pretty good with Insight. They hadn't looked incredible or anything, but it definitely was not a move where people could point and say, haha, we told you so, method shouldn't have got dropped, blah, blah, blah. But they had looked decent, but this was a big win. Optic, coming into stage 2, I thought Optic was probably the third best team in the league, behind FaZe and Dallas. Because I think I actually said fourth. I think I put them behind New York as well because of New York's win over them in the major. But I mean, to be top 4, but then to lose to Toronto, who looked really bad in stage 1. obviously made a roster change, and they hadn't looked incredible in Stage 2. Just another shocking result at the major with this upset.
Yep.
And then we drop down to losers bracket, London versus the Thieves. LAT, they reverse sweep London. They send them out of the Stage 2 major in top
10.
9, 10, yeah.
Yep.
So what'd you think of Thieves?
Yeah, I think this is just kind of, I don't know. This is just carrying on with the Thieves' unexpected run. Talked about it a little earlier today already. Most people didn't really expect them to beat Paris on limited practice, and London's a relatively new team as well, but obviously they'd at least played with this lineup in their Stage 2 group play matches. So even if they're a newer lineup, they still had more practice than the Thieves, and it looked like early in this series that London was going to come away with it. It started out with an Apocalypse Hardpoint 250 163 for London, and then Miami Search was 6-2 London. So not particularly close first two maps, but then LA Thieves flip a switch and pull off the reverse sweep to keep their run alive.
In the next match, Florida versus Seattle. And Seattle comes out and they beat Florida, and they send them out in a tie for 9th, 10th. So what did you think of Florida's early exit from the Stage 2 major?
I mean, to be honest, with both of our picks before this, we, just based on who they were playing in that first round, we had expected the Gorillas to beat them before this and not even get to this match. So although top 10 is probably most likely disappointing to the organization, overall they still ended up at least getting one win and getting some CDL points from this major. I was looking at it after when I was writing the article about Slack getting benched, which we'll obviously talk about later. Florida came in last place in their group in both Stage 1 and Stage 2, but in the Stage 1 major they obviously went on that little bit of a loser's bracket run and they got top 8, I believe. And then in this one major, they came in last place in the Stage 2 group play, but they didn't come in last place in the major, and they get top 10. So they're at least, if they're coming in last place in group play, but not coming in last place in the tournament, it's at least a sign that, maybe this lineup was better in tournament play and just didn't, look at the group play matches as seriously. I don't know. That's just speculation, but that's just something interesting I thought about, that they ended up coming in last place in both groups so far this year, but they didn't come in last place in the actual tournaments. For this match in particular, I was actually thinking that Florida might have pulled off a win here, just because I believe coming into this match, or coming into the match previously with the Thieves, no 4 seed from group play had won. We talked about it at the other major, that team that just started out and loses round 2, but didn't play in the round before it. Both of them lost, and then with the Thieves winning before it, that the 4 seeds were 0-3. But Seattle ends up ending that streak and becoming that first 4 seed to actually clutch up and move past losers round 2 in the major. Nothing really too major that we have to go in depth about for this one. I think if I look at the stats real quick, I'm pretty sure Gunless had a pretty good series. Yeah, Gunless had a 1.33 KD overall, but he was the only positive KD on Seattle. And then for Florida, Awakening dropped to 1.19, and he was the only positive KD on Florida. So obviously stats don't mean everything, but that's a little bit interesting.
Yeah, and we would see Florida make a roster change after the major. We'll get to that a little bit later. But we have the first really big match of the, it's like one of the first real exciting matches with actual contenders involved in the major. We had Dallas versus Minnesota. In this season, we'd seen Minnesota beat Dallas both times. Both pretty big upsets, considering Dallas is the defending world champions, and at both points Minnesota had not looked incredible coming in to their match with Dallas, and Dallas actually ends up winning this one 3-2. What are your thoughts on Dallas actually breaking the losing streak against Minnesota?
Yeah, I mean the most shocking thing obviously was that it was just a role reversal where in this series Minnesota took the hard points, Dallas took the S&Ds, which in this case both went to round 11.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in their previous matchups, Dallas was taking the hard points, Minnesota was taking the searches, and that's how they won. So Dallas kind of took Minnesota's recipe for success and was able to use it to their advantage. I thought that was a little interesting just because I had higher expectations for Minnesota based on how well they had looked with Standy. They were technically undefeated coming into the major with Standy in the lineup. And I was looking forward to seeing FaZe versus Minnesota at some point. At least I wanted to see how those two teams stacked up. We didn't get to see that. But it is interesting. I don't remember. I think maybe the Rocker tweeted something after one of their matches or something with accuracy. And he kind of said, in the major they improved their hard point, but when you improve one mode, another mode might lack, and that it kind of looks like that is what happened. They improved their hard point, and their search might have took a little hit. So it will definitely be interesting. Obviously, I don't expect to see any more roster changes from Minnesota heading into Stage 3. So it will be interesting to see how they perform in Stage 3, if they're able to become a consistent team in all their game modes, how they'll stack up. We've already seen them play Dallas and Optic now. So I would like to see them play FaZe in Stage 3 at some point, and kind of give us a gauge of where Minnesota sits in the overall power rankings, I guess you'll say, for CDL.
Yeah. I mean, at least Dallas, they, I don't know, like this major was up and down just like stage 2 was for them. There were like good parts, obviously, but there were also really bad parts, and you're just like, we'll get to it later, like the more bad parts, but at this point it looked like, okay, maybe Dallas has found something. Although they lose the hard points, even then you're like, well, they could come back in the next series and they can win 2 hard points and win a series. So at this point it's good. You wanted me to bring up this clip of accuracy on raid control, right?
This isn't the accuracy clip, but this
Okay.
is just Minnesota or Dallas in general. It's just a pretty crazy clip with the Rocker up 2-1 here in the control, and they get a 5-3 life advantage right now. And yeah, as you'll see right now, it's kind of cut off in the clip, but
Yeah.
Minnesota somehow, Dallas picks up all the kills there, and it goes from a 3v5 to a 3v1, and Dallas gets into the hill there with 0.1 seconds remaining. So literally just slid in time to save that round. They tie that up 2-2, force overtime, and they're able to take overtime. And if they don't get in the hill there and with the 0.1 seconds and time expires or whatever, they lose that map, they lose the following hard point, they lose 3-1. Totally changes the tournament around a little bit. So that was kind of a wild play.
Yeah. I mean, you have to go big sometimes. Like when you're a evenly matched game, or you're in an evenly matched game, it takes those big plays to really pull it off. We've seen it in multiple different matches this season, where we'll see it in the Minnesota Optic game a little bit later. But those big plays can be the difference, and it's worth it to have those big time players in those moments because they can really pull something off. So unless you have any other thoughts about Dallas and Minnesota, we can move on to Atlanta versus Toronto, part 1. Atlanta wins 3-1. Toronto wins the search, which is it's interesting. I mean, Atlanta is supposed to be one of the best search teams, although Toronto did, I think, Toronto, before New York beat FaZe in Stage 2, Toronto was the only team to beat FaZe in search. I think it was Raid in Stage 1. So
I believe that's correct.
So yeah, what do you think, Atlanta, Toronto?
Yeah, I think we don't have to talk about this one too much. Obviously, this kind of sets the stage for what happens later. Um, but that was my main takeaway from the series was just Atlanta wins 3-1, Toronto wins the search, but this is our first sign at the major in particular where it's kind of like is Atlanta struggling in search? Obviously, at that time, it was only one series that Atlanta played, and they win the series 3-1, so they're not like going nuts over dropping one search. But looking at it in retrospect, it's kind of like, okay, they started on one in search. How does this progress throughout the rest of the major? So I just think that was something interesting to look at. If we look at the stats real quick too, Abizi went 91 and 61 with a 1.49 KD overall, and Simp dropped a 1.30. So yeah, it was a pretty impressive series from FaZe, especially when we see what happens later on in the tournament too.
The next two matches on Friday were Optic versus Seattle and New York versus the LA Thieves. Optic won 3-1, eliminating the Surge from the major, and the Thieves swept the Subliners and eliminated them with a top 8 placing. Do you have any lasting thoughts on Seattle and New York being eliminated here?
Yeah, I think a lot of people were surprised that Optic lost to Toronto in the first round of the winners bracket, so most people didn't expect them to be here. But based on them losing that first series, some people might have been, oh boy, what's going on? Is Optic in another, like little rut? Are they going to get eliminated? We're just losing 2 series back to back. But that's not what happens. They respond. They're able to take down Seattle. They lose map 1, but then they win the next 3. So nothing too crazy from that series in particular that really sticks out to me. But obviously the big one there, Subliners, LA Thieves. I did not expect the Thieves to take this match at all. Especially, we've already touched on a couple times how good Subliners looked in Stage 2 group play, and Thieves coming in with that limited practice. You would have expected New York to probably take this, but the Thieves took care of business. Their Cinderella run continues there, and New York goes out of the event with an 0-6 map count, very surprisingly.
We move on to Saturday, so we're getting down to the final few teams in the major. The losers bracket is progressing. We have Toronto versus LA Thieves and Minnesota versus Optic. I mean, obviously we have to mention that the LA Thieves, they lose here, they get swept by Toronto, but overall a very impressive showing by a roster that hadn't played a match before. What did you think of Draza and Draza coming in and Kenny moving to main AR and the role swaps? What did you think of this iteration of the Thieves?
They definitely exceeded my expectations, obviously. Myself and a lot of other people didn't think they would make it past Paris, and they ended up going on to win 3 series. Do I think this is the final LA Thieves roster that we see when Champs comes around? No. But based on this performance, it might be the roster that we see at the start of Stage 3.
Yeah.
Not really sure what to expect from them. They have shown, obviously, with them, moving on from Temp and benching Slasher, that they're willing to make changes. So we could very well see them make a change heading into Stage 3. But I think because they won these 3 matches at this major, they might be like, okay, maybe we have something here, and they might give this specific 4-man lineup a little bit of a leeway and give them more time to see what they're able to do. So that's definitely one of my storylines heading into Stage 3 at least. Yeah, they get swept here by Toronto, which in the grand scheme of things probably they get
Not a
swept
bad loss.
and eliminated by the team that wins it all. So yeah. Obviously, they exceeded people's expectations, but I'm extremely interested in seeing either A, what the Thieves do with their roster heading into Stage 3, whether they change or not, and then B, if they don't change, how they perform in Stage 3.
I think of this iteration of the Thieves, I think of them as kind of like the Chicago Bears or something, where you have Mitch Trubisky, obviously not there anymore, but when he was, they would win 8 games or 9 games, get to the playoffs, and like there's hope. There's hope that they could turn the corner and be this championship contender. But ultimately, I think there is a ceiling here, and I think it might. In my personal opinion, I think this is like a honeymoon period where everything's going good, going well, excuse me, and eventually that will end, and there will have to be another roster change. And I also think there's just so much time because there's about 4 months, presumably, to champs, because a champs is almost always in mid-August. It's April 14th now. We're going into the 14th. That's 4 months. You're telling me that Thieves, or really most of these teams, aren't going to make at least one more roster change between now and August? I don't see that happening, especially because the Thieves are not going to be content with getting top 6 or whatever at the major. Like, they're going to expect more. So if they get top 6 at the next major, there's going to be the expectation that people are actually, like, they're going to want to get top 4, get to the finals, win a championship, because LA Thieves, that's their whole brand, is like, we want to be cool, we want to be at the forefront of esports, but you can't be at the forefront if you're getting top 6 at events, in all honesty.
That's a good point.
And then we obviously have Minnesota and Optic. This is a really boring match. I don't think we really need to talk about it at all. I don't think anything important happened. Obviously, we should talk about the ending of the match. Minnesota and Optic, they're kind of trading haymakers. They go to Game 5, and it comes down to the Iceman himself, Lamar Accuracy, Betty, and he pulls off one of the craziest clutches to actually win a match that I remember in COD history, and especially since this is against Optic, it's an even bigger deal, because if this happens against Paris, it's not that big a deal. No offense to the Paris is winning champs crowd, but yeah, I'll try to bring it up real quick. Just an incredible clutch from Accuracy. Do you want to give any extra context to this before I jump into it?
Yeah, so, Minnesota is able to take the first hard point, and then Optic responds by taking Express SMD 6-2. And we kind of already had touched on it with Minnesota, earlier. It looked like they improved in hard point, but their search kind of took a hit as a result. So that kind of reiterates that sentiment. And then Minnesota takes the control. Optic dominates Game 4. Moscow hardpoint 250 to 138 to force that Game 5 on Moscow search. And Optic went up 5-3 in this search. And the Rocker are able to come back and string 3 rounds together. Now, most notably, before we start this clip here, as you can kind of tell at the top there, Optic does get the first 2 kills of round 11. So it's a 4v2 situation. And you can play the clip if you want now. But Accuracy starts it off by getting this kill on Envoy to make it a 3v2 in favor of Optic still. While Attach comes for the pinch here on Eskies, he gets taken out. So it's a 1v3 situation with their tournament life on the line. And then all 3 Optic players just stack up perfectly for Accuracy. Like, you can't even draw that up even better. So I think that was kind of like understated in the fact that not only was it a 1v3, just instantly, but that was an ace in round 11 from a 4v2 situation. Like that, like you said, that was just a wild play. I would have to, put some serious thought into actually thinking about how, ranking it in terms of the greatest plays of all time. So I don't really want to say anything in that regard, but, it's definitely one of the coolest plays that we've seen this year.
The only other one I can honestly think of off the top of my head is Attach at World War II Stage 2 playoffs, or Stage 1 playoffs or something. So that's pretty much the only other one that comes to mind, if you don't include Full Sail as just like the overall moment and just being historic. But
that's what I mean. Yeah, I would have to put some thought into it to see what else I can think of. But
regardless, it's a huge play.
Yeah, it's one of the top plays of the season easily. Even if the season like you said, we've got 4 more months of this. I think even in September and October, we'll still be going back and thinking about this play in some form or the other. Yeah, I wrote the recap for that series, and I actually didn't have like the best stats for the first 4 maps, but then it doesn't matter at the end of the day because he shows up. He dropped 13 in that game 5, gets the ace round 11, obviously, to win it. So kind of just proves, whatever happens before that doesn't really matter. You get the job done in that last final round. That's all that matters.
And I mean, just after this game, the Rocker social media manager, bless his heart, decides to make a meme, and it seems innocuous at the time, and it's I don't have the picture, but it's essentially a picture of the Optic guys after the loss, head in hands, really heartbroken that they just choked a 1v3 or a 3v1 in round 11, and the Rocker tweet, "We are witnessing a breakdown," or something like that, and social media just blows up. Like, everybody decides, I'm going to have a take on what social media managers post now, and Scump comes in, says, "This is some of the most disrespectful shit I've ever seen," and Rocker players are saying this is BS, like this is the worst social media post ever. So I know we have some social media friends. I just thought it was a really big moment. Accuracy's clutch, and then it was followed by an immediate shitstorm on Twitter about something completely unrelated. Like, it didn't actually matter in the grand scheme of things. I thought it was just interesting that Twitter essentially blew up after this because of a tweet by the Rocker.
But that was definitely interesting.
Yeah, that was basically all of Saturday night, the rest of Saturday night. And then the final match of Saturday, Atlanta FaZe versus the Dallas Empire. I believe that this match at the Stage 1 Major was on Sunday. I think that was the schedule change. They pushed the winners finals to Saturday evening instead of Sunday afternoon. So Atlanta beats Dallas 3-1 here. They secure another Grand Finals appearance, back-to-back Grand Finals appearances at the majors in the 2021 season. What are your thoughts on Atlanta beating Dallas again?
Kind of, same thing we talked about just a little earlier with their first match against Toronto. Atlanta wins those respawns, but they drop that search. And at this time, Atlanta's played 2 series. They're 2-0. They're 6-0 in respawn, but they're 0-2 in search. And that age-old saying that we always talk about, search wins championships. That's got to be, just like I said a couple minutes ago, that's got to be in the back of the head now, especially looking back on things. Is just like, what's going on with Atlanta's search. Dallas in particular had been struggling in search heading into the major, and they were able to beat Atlanta, which was considered one of, if not the best search teams in the game heading into the major. So obviously, heading into Stage 3, search is probably going to be something that Atlanta will heavily be focusing on, trying to improve.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they still won the series. So, yeah, and like you said, back-to-back grand finals.
At this point, even though they've looked weakened a little bit, or they didn't look as good, still they hadn't lost at a major. So they had won all their matches in Stage 1 major, and then they come in and they beat the Ultra, they beat Dallas. Everything looks to be okay. Like, no team looks to be a major threat to them at this point. But then we go to Sunday, and Toronto beats up Minnesota to get to winners finals, and then Toronto also follows that up with a 3-1 win over Dallas to get to grand finals. So Toronto has a lot of momentum. What are your thoughts on Toronto's overall loser bracket run and these 2 matches in particular?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to spend too much time on these, I feel like, but it's kind of interesting to think about, like you just said, with the schedule change. That might have played a factor here with Toronto getting to, they end up playing 16 maps on Sunday, and they win 11 of them. So obviously momentum played some role in this sense that Toronto was able to continue rattling off wins.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem like fatigue affected them, obviously, because they end up getting the dub in the end. But it was interesting, at least just looking at it statistically, that Toronto dropped the first match against Minnesota, then they won 3 in a row, and then they go into the Dallas series and they drop first map against Dallas, but then they win the next 3 after that. So they were technically on a 3-map winning streak heading into losers finals and grand finals. But even in the grand finals, I guess spoiler alert a little bit, they lose first map to Atlanta. So technically they played 3 series on Sunday, right? So 16 maps.
Mm-hmm.
They played 3 series. And they were 0-3 in map 1s. But that means they went 11-2 in every other map aside from the first map they played in the series.
Yeah.
So that's kind of impressive. Maybe that plays a factor in veto, so they're getting maybe map 1 in all 3 of the series wasn't their pick.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we don't know for sure, but that's something that could make sense. But yeah, that's my big takeaway from setting up for the grand finals. At least is Toronto got hot at the right time.
Definitely got hot, and this was a point of contention around the stage 1 major, where people found out that there was no advantage for the winners bracket team. So in this case, FaZe came in, they were undefeated in the major, and they were essentially on level playing field with Toronto. And factoring in, and this is where people begin to disagree usually, Toronto, in some people's minds, had an advantage. They played 8 maps as kind of like a warm-up for their match with FaZe, while FaZe obviously probably played a scrim or 2 before they got on to play Toronto. But they come in, Toronto does, they drop map 1, like you said, to Atlanta. So they're down 0-1. Then they go up 2-1 with maps 2 and 3. Atlanta comes back with 2 maps of their own, and then Toronto is like, all right, I think we're good. We're just going to finish this out. 6, 7, 8. Toronto wins the stage 2 major. The second straight year that actually they've won an event in the Call of Duty League season. They won, I think it was the Toronto home series, if I'm not mistaken.
Home series,
yeah,
the last home series, MW.
So they come back and they pull off a really big upset. What are you thinking about Toronto now that they're stage 2 champions?
I mean, certainly wasn't expected, right?
Yeah, no.
I think looking at it overall, kind of talked about it earlier just a little while ago with Atlanta struggling in search, and a lot of people say search and destroy wins championships, right? And Toronto ends up going 7-1, I believe, in search at this major, and their only loss in search came in the grand finals against FaZe. It was on Moscow. I believe FaZe went up 4-0, then Toronto went up 5-4. And in that 10th round, I know there was a 1v1 situation, so I believe it was when Toronto was up 5-4. I could be wrong on that part, but I know the 1v1 situation is CleanX versus Arcides.
Mm-hmm.
Toronto has the bomb planted on the Moscow bomb site by Eskies there, and CleanX has an artillery strike that he hasn't used yet. And there's like 30 seconds left or whatever, 27 seconds, I believe, something like that. And CleanX pings the artillery, so he knows where Arcides is, but he decides not to use the actual bombardment of the artillery. And after Arcides realizes that, he just hops on the bomb right away. And then for whatever reason, CleanX doesn't call in the artillery again for like 8 seconds. And by the time he actually calls in the bombardment, Arcides defuses the bomb. So not only do they effectively lose that round, they lose the streak too, and then Atlanta comes away with a round 11 victory. So Toronto going 7-1, they really easily could have went 8-0 in search at this major, and their only loss was that round 11 with that one little mistake. So that's the big takeaway for me. Right now, you have to say Toronto is the best team in the game. And if they're really good at search, it's going to come down to potentially what team is able to take searches away from them. Because if we look at the grand finals, the maps. Atlanta did win the first 2 hardpoints. They took Garrison Hardpoint 250 to 198,
Mm-hmm.
and then Apocalypse Hardpoint 250 to 147. So they're not, like super close, but they're not super blowouts. And then even though Toronto wins those the 6th and 7th map, we go to Checkmate Hardpoint on match point, and a lot of people, including myself, are kind of like, okay, phases looked really good in Hardpoint. This is going to that map 9. It's going to come down to another search, but Toronto was able to win the one hardpoint that mattered most to seal the deal. So, obviously, going into stage 3, all eyes are going to be on Toronto. People are going to try to, take them down,
Mm-hmm.
and it will be interesting to see how they perform, and if they're able to continue performing well in search, 1, and then 2, if they're able to, find a recipe for success in hardpoint on a consistent basis against some of these top teams. Obviously, this is just looking at the one series against FaZe where they go 1 and 2 in hardpoint, but they won hardpoints to get to their grand finals and eventually win it all. But we did kind of touch on it. They were losing that map 1 at least on Sunday. They lost all 3 map 1, so that's a hard point right there. So that might be the area where people try to attack Toronto and try to take advantage of the respawns. I don't know if that's going to be what teams decide to do, but that's what I'm going to be looking forward to in stage 3, seeing if they're able to continue playing almost perfect in search, and how they're able to perform in those respawns too.
I should note, and I don't know if this is actually brought up on the broadcast, but essentially Toronto is a European team. They have all European players. They have a European head coach. They're the only roster with an all-European lineup, and that would make them the first European team to win an event since Splice in 2017. If I'm not mistaken, because I looked up Red Reserve. They won Stage 2, not Stage 2 playoffs, but they finished first in Stage 2 of the 2018 CWL Pro League. But Splice became the first European team to win like a major event that wasn't like EGL in 2017.
It was the playoffs against
Stage 1 playoffs.
LG and IW, something like that.
So it's been nearly 4 years, and this is a really unexpected team considering the expectations that they had coming into this stage.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure how much was said about it, but it is a weird situation because obviously they're a North American team or franchise with a European roster. So I think it just comes down to how you want to word that narrative. But it's certainly the first all-European roster to win a CDL event.
Yeah.
Even when Toronto won last year, they had Methods and Classic on that team. So that's obviously a pretty cool storyline, especially for European fans. And one thing I haven't said yet, or either of us haven't touched on, is that Bance just absolutely went off in this grand final series. Had a 1.44 KD overall, and including in what was that? That was map 7, I believe. Express Search and Destroy. Toronto wins 6-0, and Bance goes 10-0 in the search. Bance ends up being named the player of stage 2, which is pretty cool because a lot of people were saying when Toronto was struggling that Bance, after Insight comes in for Methods and they aren't, getting the results that some people were expecting, some people were saying that Bance should retire, and I believe
he tweeted about it.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to pull up.
Yeah, so he tweeted right after they won the major. He screenshotted a text he sent to his fiance. The text said, "I'm crap. I might as well retire, to be honest." And his message said, "Sent this to my fiance, being deadly serious after starting stage 2 0-2 and receiving over 500 tweets to bench myself. What a turnaround, and I cannot thank my team enough. It may not seem like much, but this win means a lot to me." So obviously that's a really great moment where a player, it's very rare that a player who is performing poorly and getting so much hate and so much vitriol from the COD community, that they're able to turn it around and succeed and be able to kind of push that back into those haters' faces. And I mean, Bance is obviously a huge veteran. I believe he was on that Splice roster we were just talking about.
Yep.
So I mean, he is one of, if not I don't want to say he's the greatest European player, but he's definitely up there as far as accomplishments.
Yeah, I'm gonna double check real quick, but I'm pretty sure it was like him, Zero, Jerd, and Mad Cat.
Yeah,
If I'm
sounds right. Like I know
remembering
Jerd and
correctly.
Zero were there, and I'm almost positive because it was basically that Millennium roster from
Stage one
Black
playoffs.
Ops
Vance,
3.
Jerd, Mad Cat, Zero. Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, look at where he is. Jerd is in challengers. Mad Cat's retired. Zero hasn't been able to play all year because of visa issues. But Bance, he just won an event. It's incredible, and he deserves a lot of credit for turning around. And Toronto and Marky B and the team deserves credit for sticking with him and not just caving and saying, well, we're just gonna swap him out and bring in methods or sign a challengers player. They stuck with him, and it's paying dividends right here.
Yeah, I think Mad Cat is still playing in amateurs. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he's at least playing this year. But besides the point, definitely, especially with that tweet from Bance and the narrative behind that, it's a really cool story. And congratulations to him and Toronto for being able to pull off this victory, because it's a pretty cool story.
On that
Overall.
note, let's talk RosterMania, because Toronto didn't bench Bance, but teams did bench players, and we actually have several points for RosterMania.
Before we do WrestleMania, can we just show the standings real quick?
Yep, give me a second. I will pull it up. I have the tweet here. So yeah, this is the standings after stage 2. So you have FaZe in first with 225 despite losing at the major. And then down at, at last place, you have London with 30 points after a pretty poor performance. Any thoughts on this as we go into stage 3? So we're basically halfway done with the CDL regular season. So what are you thinking now that we're done with 2 stages?
I just wanted to leave this up here because I'm thinking that, it kind of makes sense, especially with what we've seen so far in this early stage, pre-stage 3 RosterMania so far. It's obviously been a couple days, but looking at the teams that have already made some changes, we see Florida in 9th place with only 60 points, Paris and tied for 10th with 50, and that's below the cutoff there for COD champs, which obviously the top 8 teams make champs at the end of the season. So that was my main thought process here, is that we're seeing some of these teams that aren't where they want to be right now being proactive and trying to make a change, which obviously we saw at the end of stage 1 with Methods getting benched and Insight coming in. We were kind of like, wow, Ultra might be making a little bit of a preemptive change, especially, Methods had his 1v4 against Paris, and, it looked like at least he wasn't, a major issue for the team in some people's eyes, but it turns out that they bring in Insight, and even though they go 2-3 in stage 2 group play, they're able to make their run at the major when it matters most, and they secured 75 points for winning the major, which means they were at 50 before the event, and now they're in 5th place. So, and just also real quick, looking at the standings too, the Thieves are there in 6th with 110. If they weren't able to pick up these 3 wins at the major, they would be just above the Gorillas barely. So that's kind of, those 3 wins at this tournament were pretty big for them.
So there have been so this is unconfirmed because like we'll talk about, New York is reportedly going to make a roster change or looking to make a roster change, but as of now we have 6 teams that have announced a roster change of some sort, 7 if you include New York. So Toronto, obviously they benched Methods, they bring in Insight. The Thieves made multiple roster changes, but this latest one they benched Slasher. Then they've traded or released, probably traded Temp, and that brings up Paris, who obviously just acquired Temp. There's been a lot of roster changes. Pretty much the bottom half of the league, almost every team there has made a roster change. So it's really interesting. Seattle hasn't and LAG haven't. But we
True.
don't really know what's going to go on the rest of this week. I don't see Seattle actually making a roster change. As surprising as that sounds, considering they're second to last and or I guess they're third to last in a tie, and they looked so bad in stage one. But I wouldn't see them making a roster change at this point. But do you want to get into the RosterMania of?
That's. I just wanted the standings up there so we had some point of reference.
I just took it off so I could see my notes. So we had some big points of RosterMania today. I don't know if it's the biggest, but Florida, a team that has underperformed according to expectations, they benched Slacked, who was kind of the new guy on the team coming into this season with Neptune. At the beginning of the season, was there a consensus that Slacked was in fact going to start over Havoc? Because I don't really remember anything before the season about these rosters, but Slacked comes in. He played on Seattle last year, obviously didn't have a good year as a team, and he signs with Florida, and they've looked decent at times. They've looked good, I guess. They choked away a win against New York at the Stage 1 major, but overall they've underperformed, and they decide to bench him. So what do you think of Florida making this change, and who do you think are some possible replacements?
So before the season, when Florida first introduces its lineup, the lineup is Skies, Awakening, Slacked, and Havoc.
Mm-hmm.
And then
they bring in
after they make that initial announcement, I think it was early January, or it's right before the, what was it called? The Kickoff Classic, I think.
Yeah, the Kickoff Classic, the preseason.
It was relatively close to that, where they announced that they were gonna, or Crone actually wrote the report that they were considering benching Havoc for Neptune because they had signed Neptune as just a substitute player, and then they ended up giving Neptune the shot, and then they start the season with Neptune, Slacked, Awakening, and Skies. Slacked was the one, similar to with Method. Slacked announced this himself almost instantly after the major, which I thought was kind of interesting. It technically didn't even come from the organization. But aside from that, I just think with this three-man core right now of Skies, Awakening, and Neptune, they don't have a leadership presence on that team.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of what Slack provided. You know, he's not the guy who's going to drop huge numbers every single map, kind of like we've seen Big Wake do often this year. But that's just not what Slack's going to do. He's going to, be the fundamental player, he's going to do the right plays and kind of be that leadership figure, especially considering, how much experience he has compared to the other three guys on this team. And now Crone is the one, CDL Intel reporting that potential replacements for Slack could be either Havoc, who is already signed to Florida as a substitute after being replaced by Neptune, Yeez, who's a Challengers player, and then Decimate, who we saw, on multiple pro teams before. Most recently, he was on the Gorillas last year in MW. And we saw Decimate play with Neptune and Challengers before Neptune got the call to Florida earlier this year. So, of those three, I think Decimate makes the most sense to me, just because, like I said, he's played with Neptune, and, Deci's kind of like, known for his S&D play, and that could maybe help the team out. But just all three of those names, to me, it just feels like none of them, unless Havoc is like completely changed as a player since he last, was in the scene, it doesn't feel like they really have that leadership presence. And I don't really see, you can't count on Neptune to be a leader. Just for example, because he's just coming into COD. It doesn't seem to me like Awakening is that type of player. He seems like more of, just do whatever you want on the map and kill a star player. So is Skies going to step up in that role if they pick up somebody like Decimate or Yeez or Havoc? I'm not sure. But I think that's my biggest concern, at least with this benching of Slack and the benching of Slack and the three potential replacements that have been reported so far. It seems like that leadership quality could be missing from this team unless a change that unless somebody else is picked up.
So just a little bit background on Decimate. A lot of people know him, but they might not have seen him this season because he hasn't been in the CDL. Last year he played for the Gorillas. He came in January, or he came in on launch weekend, excuse me. And then he played the rest of the season with LAG. He did not get picked up by a pro team to start the season, so he's been in challengers all season, and he's done decently well. He was on Insight, Draza, and Twerk's team. They won the first Open, the Challengers Open. They also won the 8th Cup, the 9th Cup, and then he played with Sib, Draza, and Dave Patty, and they won the most recent elite playoffs. So I mean, there's a lot of talent on his teams, but he seems to be having a lot of success. He's also teams with Decimate. Recently, teamed with Decimate, but he was with Phantoms and Gendroid and Rex, and so he has actually played with Havoc too. So there's a lot of Florida connections on this team. Like if they end up going with Yeez has a connection to Havoc. Decimate, obviously, like you just said, he has connection to pro players, and he's played with guys before like Neptune. So it's interesting. I don't really know who. I've stopped giving my definitive answers on roster changes because I didn't think the Thieves were going to be good. And while I do think it is more of a honeymoon period, I don't know. It's just my opinion. I think that's what's going to happen. I thought that what was it, the OGLA roster last season, I thought that was going to be an incredible roster at the beginning of the year with like JCap, Slasher, Kenny, TJ, Dashy. I was like, oh my god, this team is incredible. They have leadership, they have raw talent, they have slaying power. What could go wrong? Well, everything goes wrong eventually. So I don't really know what the solution is for them because last season Florida was kind of up and down. I believe they won 2 events, one with Pharaoh, and so I believe the first with his Mox, and then they bring in Pharaoh. They win another event. So
they won 3 events last year.
Well, yeah. So because they won one with Big Wake in the roster. So 3 different rosters for Florida last season, 3 event wins. Who knows what's really good for them? And 4v4 is different. I don't know if that's playing a role. Maybe not having Pharaoh in the lineup. I'm not really sure what the deal is. They just haven't looked consistent this season.
Yeah, and I think the other side of the argument, like I'm saying, like I just said, I don't really think any of the 3 players that are reportedly being considered for the position bring extreme leadership capabilities to this team. But on the other side, we have seen teams kind of like FaZe last year where they didn't have that leadership, and I know that was in 5v5, but they didn't necessarily have that IGL type player, and they still found success. So it's certainly possible if Florida goes with one of these 3 players, they plug them in. All 3 of the players fit the need for the team at least because you have Skies and Awakening holding down that AR and the flex roles, however you want to look at it. So with Neptune on a sub, you need to bring in another sub player regardless of who it is. So from a role standpoint, it makes sense. And if I'm picking from these 3 players, just based on what we've seen, I think Decimate would be my pick just because I think he's a really great player. Like I kind of already said, he's a strong search player, and he could, bring that jolt of life that Florida might need to turn things around. But if they do end up going with Decimate, that's certainly one of the questions that I'm going to be looking at is just to see how the team performs or if anybody steps up into that leadership role.
Another RosterMania point is Paris. Paris deciding to completely release, not bench, but completely release Fire. So he is a free agent. He's actually already on a Challengers team because things work fast in Challengers. And the guy that he's replacing on Wester, Temp, is now joining the Paris Legion. He was previously benched on the Los Angeles Thieves roster. He started the season with them. Last season he played for New York. What do you think of Temp coming onto Paris? Do you think he can make the kind of impact that they need to, get in the top 8 and hopefully get in the top 6 and beyond?
I think before we get into that, I'm pretty sure Fire's replacing Glow Frosty at least from
Yeah, so
the previous roster.
there were two. Yeah, because I mean we'll talk about it with New York, but a lot of things are happening
Yeah.
in the CDL that is affecting challengers, and then you
Yep.
have a lot of roster changes.
So to answer your question, I think I mean I obviously like this move. I've talked previously about I think Temp is a really good player. He might have had his struggles earlier this year on that Thieves roster, and it seemed like when the Thieves started to struggle that he was going to be like that odd man out, right? It seemed like, Kenny and Slasher kind of like those franchise players at the time, and then, it's kind of between TJ and Temp, and it looked like, with past history that Kenny and Slasher were going to try to play with TJ still, so that kind of left Temp on the outside looking in from that kind of standpoint, similar to like what we saw with Gunless last year on Chicago Huntsman, right? Like they weren't going to drop Scump or Formal, and
Or
they
Envoy.
weren't going to drop Envoy and our cities, so Gunless was kind of just like that odd man out. But regardless, I think Temp is a strong player. I think the biggest problem with Paris is that it seemed like, at least recently, as recent as stage 2, is that they were kind of going back and forth between Scraps and Fire on that flex role. And I think that Temp, although we've seen Temp play that flex role in the past or in previous games, it seems like just based on some of the tweets we've seen that they're going to put Scraps back on that flex or the second AR, and then the sub duo is going to be Temp and Classic. So obviously it's a little too early to say, how they're going to perform or anything like that, but it's certainly interesting. I think Temp is a good sub player, and Classic is kind of like talking about with Slack. He's the guy who's going to make the fundamental plays, do the dirty work, however you want to word it. So with Classic in front of Temp, that could be like a pacing thing that allows Temp to, from a statistical standpoint, put up numbers that were more acclimated to seeing him produce in the past games. So that's certainly interesting. And it's worth noting also that we have seen Temp play with Classic and Aqua in the past. He played with Classic on Denial and Elevate in AW, and then he played with him again on NB in World War II. And then he played with Aqua in World War II on Echo Fox after that NB team broke up. And then he played with Aqua on Splice and Black Ops 4. So he has some previous history with both of these teammates. So it's not like, they're going in and chemistry is going to be an immediate issue. They have at least some like groundwork, and they have previous experience playing with each other. So I'm certainly excited to see how this revamped Paris roster plays. I think, but like I said, I think the biggest thing is, at least for now, it seems like they're going to go in with Temp on the sub and Scraps on the flex. And when they were using the QBZ, it looked like Scraps was super comfortable in that AR role, at least in this game. So maybe this will, similar to bringing Standy into Minnesota and moving Priesta to that second AR, we could see a similar effect from like a role standpoint where changing one player unlocks additional potential for the team overall, kind of like we saw with Minnesota. So it'll be interesting to see if something similar happens with Paris in stage 3.
I think a new environment for Temp overall would be good. I remember him saying, I think it was in a press conference during stage 1 when he was on the Thieves, he said that he really had to become adjusted to how the Thieves worked, because Slasher is the leader, and you have Kenny and TJ who have been with Slasher for basically an entire year plus, so they know how he operates, and Slasher knows what he wants to do. He's kind of like an Aches personality where he knows what he wants, he's going to make you do it, and you have to abide by those rules. And Temp said he had to basically check his ego because he wasn't used to that. New York was not like that. So maybe he can thrive in a more like loose environment, or like a different environment as a whole. I know Classic, he's hailed as like one of the greatest teammates by many COD pros. Like everybody loves Classic. Aqua has been a leader for many years. I think Aqua is a great player. And obviously Scraps. I think Scraps is super talented, and And there have been times during the season where I thought Paris, like, man, they're so close. Like, they're so close to breaking out of like the bottom half of like the teams that don't have a chance to really win champs. They've been close, but they just haven't been able to get out of it. Maybe adding temp will break them out of the bottom four and into the top half of the CDL. But we'll see. He's gonna have an uphill battle because they're not gonna have a good group because they're probably gonna be with like FaZe or Optic or Dallas or New York, or hopefully not like three of them, because that would be like the worst case scenario, to be with a bunch of the good teams, and you just know you're gonna start in losers bracket most likely. So we'll see.
It's.
What were you saying?
Sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say it's hard either way. I mean, just last stage we saw it was Group B with 3 teams go 3-2, and the other 3 teams go 2-3.
Mm-hmm.
So like the league's super competitive this year, and it's super close. So regardless of what teams Paris is in a group with, it's going to be an uphill battle for them. But if they're able to, get to work right away and figure stuff out, maybe they have like a little bit of a honeymoon phase, or they just, maybe they mesh well right away and are able to go on the streak. Who knows? But it'll definitely be interesting either way to see how this lineup performs. But also real quick, kind of like you said, I just wanted to bring up, it's interesting that Paris straight up just released Fire and not even like kept him on the bench.
Mm-hmm.
Coming into the season, Fire was, for a lack in a season where there weren't necessarily a ton of rookies at the start of the year, Fire was one of those like top rookie of the year candidates, because it was like him, Diamond Con, and Neptune, right, coming right away as the rookies. So a lot of people were picking between the 3 of them, and now he's not even like, they didn't even keep him on the bench. He's just like straight up not in the CDL anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really, I don't know. I don't know how in depth that move goes or what's behind that decision making. But just for a sports comparison, like if you have a top prospect, especially in baseball, which has an intricate minor league system, like if you have a top prospect and you call him up to the big leagues and he doesn't perform right away, most teams aren't just releasing him; they're they're demoting him down to the minors, but they still have him on the team. That's not the case here with Paris. He's just straight up not on Paris. So, like, technically, if Optic thinks, just for example, if Optic thinks that they see a lot of potential in Fire, they could sign him to a minimum contract and put him on the bench and just, hold on to him in the sense of trying to develop. So, that's also a point Tremor just brought up too. Did Paris have any bench players? From what we know, their coach is technically their substitute. So they're not even keeping Fire as a substitute. So that's definitely just something that kind of raised my eyebrow with the whole situation, that he wasn't benched. He was just straight up dropped.
My thinking, or my theory, is that Paris is like, it's a pandemic, so like businesses need to operate like as much as you can cut, for many of these, even though pretty much like all the CDL owners are either millionaires and billionaires. So I mean, money is not as like a $50,000 contract is not as like big as say a small business. But I would say it probably has something to do with money. Like, to be completely honest, like Paris in COD, it's not like traditional sports where, say in basketball, because I think basketball is like the closest comparison to COD, where like there is a lot of individual freedom, and you really, one player can make the difference for a team. So in basketball, if you have a young prospect and he's not doing well, I mean, there is the G League, but you could also just bench him, and then he comes off the bench when you need him. He plays a little bit at a time, and he progressively, hopefully, improves, and he also would increase his playing time with his progression. In COD, we know it's not like that. So when a guy goes on the bench, it's typically for good. Like, there are instances where a guy gets benched and they bring him back in another iteration of the roster. But for the most part, when a player is benched, they're there for the rest of the season, or until they're traded or released or something. So as far as that, I think it's more of a money situation for Paris, trying to cut costs, not having to pay Fire for the next 4 or 5, 6 months of the season. And So that's my opinion. I don't know if that's true, but I would love a confirmation for how and why they were able to cut Fire like that halfway through the season.
No, and if it's a business decision, that's a good
Hmm.
point. Or if it's a business or money thing, I totally understand, especially with the pandemic and everything. But if that was just, when Fire said he was actually released and not benched, that
Yeah.
just was, it raised an eyebrow or raised my eyebrows, and I was like, whoa.
Trim said Shakad utilized bench players better like traditional sports. I personally think so. I'm of the mind, like, I know there are older COD players that think, oh, you can't sub in guys for search only, but some players are just really bad in search. Like,
We saw it with Seattle last year.
yeah,
They at
I,
least
I
tried
don't
it.
I don't want to call Enable out, but
Yeah.
Enable was known to be a relatively poor search player, at least compared to his respawn play, because he was an entry guy. He was very important for his team's success in respawns, but when it came to search, he wasn't that good. And I don't know if like his teams lost because of him, but I
Yeah.
think having say Teddy Rex, the Seattle like search and destroy coach, advisor, whatever he is, or having someone like Tupac or someone that is well versed in search who can lay out game plans. Like this is their only job. Their only job is to win search. Like you create the game plans. You're basically a search and destroy coach. You're a player coach essentially. And I think having something like that would be fun. We did see Seattle do it last year where they actually brought in Pander for Enable. I believe it was against New York during one of the events, and then obviously that just ended up with Enable getting benched like completely. But there were a lot of roster changes there. But uh,
They at least tried it.
yeah, that was the only. I think that's the only time since the CDL started that that's actually been done where it hasn't been like an emergency. It's been just like a strictly play issue. So I personally think. What do you think? Do you think esports or COD esports should be using substitute players?
No, I think that's something we can talk about much more in depth at another time. But it's certainly, on its basic level, I definitely would like to see that develop as time goes on in the CDL. We've kind of already talked about in previous episodes how I think as the years go on, we get to a point where these organizations have like that minor league or those academy teams, and um, I think part of getting to that step is eventually getting to a point where maybe bench players are utilized mid-series more frequently. Do I think that's something that will happen this year or in the immediate future? No, but obviously we saw it minimally used last year, at least experimented with. Didn't really go as planned for Seattle, but it was cool to see it at least attempted. So some teams might not, necessarily be incentivized to try it out, but it's definitely something down the road I think we might see more of.
In the final piece of RosterMania that dropped today, the New York Subliners, according to Crone, he reported this on dotesports.com. He said the Subliners are in discussions with Atlanta FaZe to acquire Sib, who is FaZe's only substitute player. Sib has been with FaZe essentially for the last for pretty much the entire first season as a part of the FaZe Academy,
Yep.
and he's been their substitute this season. He's been playing in challengers. So Crone says he would replace Diamond Khan in the Subliners starting lineup, and that would also be in addition to, according to Crone, Hydra, the French player who has been sidelined due to visa issues for most of the season. He would be replacing Mac. What are your thoughts on like huge roster moves if they go through for the New York Subliners?
Yeah. Those are both two massive changes. Obviously, nothing is confirmed yet,
Yep.
and New York would have to actually, most likely, they would have to buy out Sib from
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta to get him. So, it seems like, obviously, if Crone's reporting it, it seems like he believes it's going to happen, but things can change over the next few days. So it'll definitely be interesting to see if it comes to fruition. But I certainly hope it does, just because I've heard so many good things about Sib from a gameplay standpoint. I've heard some stuff about outside of the game, just from like a toxicity standpoint or whatever. Like all that aside, just strictly in game, I've heard he's a really good player. So I would love to see him get a chance in the Pro League. And then obviously, a ton of people have been waiting to see Hydra. He was supposed to be, like you said, he was supposed to be in New York's starting lineup at the start of the season, but visa issues kind of derailed that. So if he comes into the lineup now, it'll be his long-awaited debut in the Pro League. And if both of these changes are confirmed, New York's roster would be Clayster, Asim, Hydra, and Sib. So it would be interesting. Obviously, they had just brought Diamond Khan in when Zuma retired, and then Mac was that kind of like mid-season change last year for New York when New York was struggling. He replaced Zero, I believe. And then New York kind of they won a home series online, and Mac was kind of that player to turn things around for them last year. And now, just a year later, he could potentially be getting benched for another player looking to turn things around for New York, especially after an 0-6 performance in the Stage 2 Major. So yeah, obviously we don't know if these are confirmed, but I'm really excited if this is finalized to see both Hydra and Sib in the Pro League. The only other thing that I'm going to bring up that I thought was at least interesting was that Clayster tweeted something about, I hope he didn't delete it.
Was it the thing about him being stressed out?
Yeah.
Yeah. So after they got knocked out, he basically said that he wanted a break.
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah,
I didn't know what the exact wording was.
He didn't say he was like going to take a break, but he said that his mental health had taken a hit. I think he said it basically started after getting dropped or being excluded from the Empire roster after champs. So it's been an ongoing thing, and we're in a pandemic, so a lot of people are struggling with mental health, their own mental health, and I want to say, as for Clayster being a competitor and for competing as long as he has, and like this is a very high level, and there is a lot of criticism that is thrown toward players. We saw it. We see it a lot with Optic. When Optic loses, both people that don't like Optic and people that are like the core members of the Green Wall, they like just spew hatred at these players, like, you suck, like, why are you so bad, blah blah blah. Like, that takes a toll. As much as people will tell you to block it out, don't listen to them, at a certain point, like, you just can't block out all the hate. And especially for Clayster, his team literally just got knocked out from a tournament. I'm sure there are unsavory things being sent to him by people that don't know him, don't know who he is as a person. So, like, people are just saying reckless, stupid stuff, and really hurtful stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if that took a toll on him.
Yeah. The only reason I was bringing that up, though, was I was thinking, obviously, before this report earlier today with even Sib, I was thinking in the back of my head, maybe that could have been an avenue to get Hydra to at least just make a temporary debut if Clayster needed a brief break.
Mm-hmm.
They could have gone with a roster of Diamond Khan, Mac, Hydra, and Asim. But obviously it seems like they're going in a different direction. I just think, and I know Zuma was talking about it on the flank earlier today, it really says a lot about the way Asim has performed this year and just him as a player overall, that with New York reportedly considering making 2 roster changes, and with a franchise player like Clayster, that the one other player sticking with Clayster is Asim and not Mac or Diamond Khan. I think that just speaks a lot for the type of player Asim is and how well he has performed so far this year. Because obviously we touched on it earlier this season. Actually, it was after New York's very first match where they had lost. It was against the Thieves, right? They lost like 3-0, but all three
Yeah.
maps were super close.
Mm-hmm.
We were just like, oh, is Hydra going to come in when he gets here? All that. And I was kind of like, oh, maybe he'll replace Mac just because Mac had this one bad series, blah, blah, blah. But we had also were like, from a role standpoint, if Hydra is supposed to be this aggressive sub player, he might come in and replace Asim just from a role standpoint. But it seems like, obviously, based on the report, that Asim's going to stick around. And I, for one, think that's, like I've already said, I think it speaks for how well he's performed. And I personally think Asim is an underrated player just because a lot of people look at stats and don't look at, like, his impact on the map. He's a super aggressive player. And setting the stage for the other guys on his team. So I think it'll definitely be interesting if this roster, if these roster changes are finalized, I can't talk right now. If these roster changes are finalized, I'll be super excited to watch this team perform in Stage 3.
Yeah, I spoke with Asim and Clay. I mean, this was a few months ago now. I've lost track of all time, so I don't really know exactly when this was. But when I talked with them, they both seemed to be enjoying playing with each other. That, like, Clay in particular, like that Asim wasn't a rookie. Like, although Asim is relatively young, I think the first like big year he had was with FaZe and Black Ops 4. But so it's only been a few years, but that few years of playing on some of the top teams, he was on Minnesota last year. So I think Clayster appreciated the fact that it wasn't just another like rookie or like second year player that hadn't played at a big LAN. There was some kind of veteran presence that Asim brought to the team, and he's looked really good at some points, and then he's looked not as good at other points. But I think overall, if he fits the team, like what I spoke about Enable earlier, Enable from a statistical standpoint was like, people would be like, oh, that guy's not very good. Like, how do you not drop like a 1.0 like KD during an event? And it's like, well, that's not his role. Like, if you look at most players in the league, like most role players, they're trying to do whatever's best for the team, and those kinds of players are invaluable. So I think I'm really happy for Asim. He seems like a really good guy. And I mean, I've already spoken about Clayster. I think he's one of the greatest COD players of all time. He's one of my favorite COD players of all time. So he's going to have his work cut out for him to kind of bring in two more young guys and try to make them work into this lineup. But he's done it before. For pretty much every lineup for the last like 2 years or so. That's what he does, and he's going to have another task if these roster changes actually happen.
And real quick too, like we're saying with Asim, I mean, you have him on your fantasy team. Like, it's not like the stigma behind him being a player who might not necessarily drop the stats. Like, he's producing this year. Regardless. Like, even if some people think he might not be like a strong player on paper, a strong statistical player, he's proving people wrong, and he's putting up numbers this year. So like, regardless of what's in the past, and we've already said it a couple of times now, I'm happy for him.
Well, I just think people look at his stats when they lose, because when you lose, you're most likely, unless you're just doing it all like Octane or something last year, where regardless of the result, you're always going to play well. They see those losses and they're like, well, he didn't have a good series. It's like, well, they lost. The entire team didn't have a good series usually when you lose. So I mean, I think Asim, he owns the plane on Checkmate. That's kind of like his thing. He is the pilot. So I think this could be it'll be the most interesting roster in Stage 3 if it happens, just because, I mean, we've been waiting for Hydra for so long. We've been teased about it. He just got to America about a month ago. He's been playing for the Subliners Academy. Sib has been a really good Challengers player all year. He was on the best challengers team for most of last year, FaZe Academy. So he has so much potential. Hydra has so much potential, and seeing them with Clay and Asim would just be incredible, especially with how poor the subliners looked at the major. If there are any questions, we can briefly take it. This one, I mean, we already knew this was going to be a big show
Oh
because
yeah.
the major had so much to talk about, and there's been quite a bit of RosterMania. Before we take questions, do you have any other roster changes that you think will happen, or you think should happen?
Nothing. Obviously, I think we might hear more stuff obviously in the next couple days, but the big ones for me are going to be seeing if LA Thieves end up sticking with this current four heading into stage 3, or if they decide to make a change, and then just looking at teams like London if they decide to make another change or not, and then maybe the Gorillas. Not really sure if they would make a change, but kind of like you were talking about, looking at I don't think FaZe is making a change, or Dallas, or Optic, or Minnesota. But technically, I guess that's 8 other teams that could potentially
Yeah.
make changes. So, it'll definitely be an interesting couple of days before we get to stage 3 next week. The other thing that we haven't even really touched on, but we can just talk about it real quick, is that all the teams were teasing a return to LAN on Twitter today.
Mm-hmm.
My big takeaway from that, we don't have to go too far into depth on this, but I think that people have to temper their expectations.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
It seems like some people are thinking like, these teams are saying, oh, we're going back to LAN, and some fans are like, oh, sick, stage 3 next week is going to be on LAN.
Yeah.
No, I do not think that's the case. Obviously,
No.
I don't know. I haven't been told anything if that's the case or not, so I guess it could be potentially happening. But I think until we hear some official news from the CDL, that fans need to hold their horses and wait a little bit. In my opinion, at least, I think that we see champs on LAN with no fans in attendance.
Mm-hmm.
If we get that, I think that's a big W already for the CDL, just compared to like a whole season of online.
Yeah.
Whereas the biggest event would be on LAN. So I think that would be good. If we get any other events on LAN in addition to champs, I think that's a massive W for the league.
Yeah.
So I think that's just, with these announcements today, we just got to pump the brakes a little bit, sit back and think. I don't think we're going to see any group play played on LAN. That just doesn't seem like logical to me.
Yeah, so many teams.
I think at earliest we might see stage 3 major on LAN. I don't think that's going to happen though. So in my eyes, I think if we get champs on LAN, that's good in my book. Anything on top of that would be absolutely superb, because obviously LAN's just better than online.
I think I mean, I don't know anything about it, like whether we have 3 stages left before champs. I think there's a possibility that stage 5, which begins at the beginning of July, literally July 1st, I think there's a possibility that they could. I would honestly want stage 5 to be on LAN, not only for like the entertainment factor, but just like getting these production teams back into like an actual like studio, or some kind of. I don't see fans being there, but I think the production team needs some practice of working a LAN event, so when we get to the biggest event of the year, we're not running into as many technical difficulties, and we can actually enjoy the event for what it is, and not have to worry like, oh, like the stream is bugging again, or like, a bunch of these PS5 or PCs, I guess, a bunch of these PCs don't work. So like,
that's a good point.
I don't know if that'll happen, but they would have 2.5 months essentially to prepare for stage 5, and then champs. I don't think the date has been announced, but stage 5 major. Let me look up real quick when the dates are. July 21st to the 25th. So I wouldn't be surprised if champs is about 2 weeks or 3 weeks after stage 5 major. Yeah, so that's usually when it is. So that would give them, like I said earlier in the show, 4 months to get their crap together and figure it out, figure the logistics out. Hopefully, more people would have vaccines by then, and COVID isn't as prevalent as a of a thing as it is right now. But anything can happen in 4 months, I guess.
Oh yeah.
Do you think? I just want to bring up this thing before we head out. Do you think that the teams like the power rankings, let's say, would change very much if we go to LAN? Like, what teams do you think would be good or bad? I guess
Um.
because there's been some discussion about this today with
Yeah.
like Aches saying like some of these players like they've never been on LAN in this kind of setting.
And that's the only thing. I'm not gonna like right now sit here and say like this team might be better than that team just based on that switch. But in particular, I think that's a good example from the sense of like saying some of these young players who haven't played
Hmm.
a serious match on LAN before, they might be at a slight disadvantage compared to a team like I'll just use Seattle for example, just because they're low in the standings right now, but they have a team full of 4 veterans who have all won championships on LAN, right?
Yeah.
Um, I might give Seattle an edge over a team that has, more of these rookie players who don't have that experience on LAN. But that's, a story for another time. I guess it would have to come down to how the teams are performing online, heading into it, all that. But I think we've seen, for the most part, I mean, we've talked about it before, like Blast is really the only example that a lot of people mention of somebody who like was a really good player online and didn't necessarily have those same results on LAN. Other than that, like a lot of people just say that like, if you're good online, you're most likely gonna succeed on LAN, at least when we're talking about these top caliber players, like guys like Simp. Like I know,
Hmm.
back in the day, people were saying that like Hook was an onliner when he first but burst onto the scene. Then he
Yeah.
goes to LAN, he was still just absolutely destroying kids. So like, those are the examples I can think of off the top of my head.
United
And
in AW or not
yeah,
AW, IW. They
yeah.
literally said that they were online warriors, and then 3 of those players have won world championships. So I don't think
Yeah.
that's the case.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. And like, it would come on a case by case basis what the matchups are. There would be a ton of factors to consider, but I definitely think that some veterans in particular might have more an advantage than some rookies who don't have that same experience on land. But I don't know if at the end of the day it's something that would necessarily just completely change the series around to the point where like a team. I don't even want to name names, but like if there was a team that goes like undefeated in stage 5 online and a team that goes 0-5 in stage 5, but they have 4 veterans, am I going to pick that 0-5 team to beat the 5-0 team just because it's the veterans? I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah, the Optic is definitely gonna be that team. They're just gonna get double first rounded at the LAN event. I mean, it would basically break the internet, but I don't think that's gonna happen. But
Yeah.
it would be not hilarious, but it would be really interesting. And there will be a team that underperforms at LAN because that's just like that's every event where they underperform. So whatever that team is, bless their mentions because it is absolutely going to be horrific when they lose at LAN and are really good online. So,
Oh yeah.
so that'll be interesting. I don't think there's anything else that we need to talk about. We've done a nearly 2 hour show now, 149 with the pre-show. So let's sign off. Next
Yeah.
week on the Ego Chall Podcast, episode 10, we're gonna make it 10 episodes. Where we'll discuss whatever roster moves actually happen. We'll see if New York decides to pull the trigger and make some roster moves. See who Florida picks up, and we'll also be previewing Stage 3 group play. We'll actually know the groups and we'll see what happens in week 1.
Yep. I guess Tremor's saying, wow, no questions. So if you have a question, Trem, you can ask real quick, but other than that, we're going to sign off.
Yeah, it is It is 1:15 real time, the realest time you can ever have. So
Yeah.
Trem, you better hurry up with your questions. Current MVP, Simp, Abizi, um, or our boy from the Dallas Empire. I don't know. What do you think? Who's the MVP?
I mean, a lot of people have been saying Abizi recently. Just like,
Yeah, I forget who tweeted it, but they said that Abizi is the best
and they were
player,
talking
and
about on the flank too, and they were saying Abizi. I mean, I have him on my fantasy team, and he's a stud. So I'll say Abizi just to give a brief answer. But I mean, obviously, the current MVP technically is Bance because he is the player of the stage too. So,
yeah.
um, that's a quick way to get around Trem's question. But if I had to pick an end of season MVP right now, just based on the two stages overall, I guess I would probably say Semper Abusi.
Who's your Nickelodeon VP? Who wins
My
just
Mitch
based on
Trubisky.
meme? Yeah, who's the meme pick for this?
Ah, man, put me on the spot.
Is it
I don't have
the
one.
Minnesota Rocker social media manager?
You can say that if you want.
It's actually Tremor. Goach is gonna come in and be the Nickelodeon VP. I don't know. Like I think Simp has to be up there because I think he's one of the best players on the best team overall. They have the best record as a whole, and it's completely irrelevant at this point because by the time champs comes around, you have to win the event to even be considered an MVP. I think that's actually, or not the season MVP, but the champs MVP, and you have to be on a really good team to get the season MVP because they're not going to give it to Big Wake if they're ninth in the standings, despite him dropping a 2 KD like every map. Like it's just not gonna happen. It's like a Russell Westbrook situation. Like you're on a crappy team, you're not gonna get it. So it's probably gonna be Simp, Abizi, somebody from Optic, probably Envoy. Like those are the guys that are gonna compete, and then you obviously have like Shotzi and Illy and those guys. Maybe Hook.
Phoenix.
He's kind of fallen down in the people's MVP rankings because his team is not performing as well. So yeah, the tissue is an issue. He's going to be also an MVP. Cammy, after sensitivity training, he's going to be also get the MVP. So who knows? Who knows what's going to actually happen? We have 4 months. 4 months. So
Yeah.
anything can happen in 4 months.
Yep.
So let's sign off. Subscribe.
Yeah.
Subscribe to the podcast. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, a bunch of other platforms. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple. It really helps us. This episode will be out within the next 8 hours. So sometime early in the morning of April 14th, we'll be back, I think, on Tuesday. So that'll be, April 20th. We'll do a show next Tuesday, April 20th, and we'll talk about Stage 3 and some probably more RosterMania. So sign it off, Bink.
Yep. Thanks for tuning in, guys, as always. Yep. Just remember, send the chow.